Good afternoon, everyone. So let's start our afternoon session. As you have seen, our panelists have changed somehow. With Nora, the new addition to our panel, and the original speaker was William Norris, and he's unable to come here.
Yeah,
right?
his son is sick. He was.
I see. I see. I'm Huaiyin, history professor at UT Austin. I'm so honored to be the moderator for this panel. So let me first introduce our first speaker, Professor Ming Ye, who is teaching at University of Boston. And she is the author of 2 books, Diaspora and Foreign Direct Investment in China and India, that's published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. And she also co-authored a book, The Making of Northeast Asia, published by Stanford University Press in 2010. And then she's the author of multiple articles published in top-notch academic journals. Her talk today is entitled Unpacking the Domestic Politics of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Let's welcome Professor Ming Ye.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. And thanks, Josh, for organizing this, and Sam for co-organizing, and all the other staff person. I also actually would like to thank Japan, the Japan Foundation. So I started this project very early, like 2014, early 2014, and that was before most people got to know about the One Belt One Road. And the reason was the Japanese Foundation hired me to do a survey of how the Chinese viewed about the TPP and RCEP. And to you guys now, it's like this such an old history. But when I went there, and when I set up my meetings with all these think tank scholars, there's agencies, and it quickly became very clear to me they were not interested in either TPP or RCEP. They were very, very passionate about the Silk Road, the One Belt One Road, and that got me. So why? What about this idea appealed to them? And of course, then within 18 months, when I went back, and all the Chinese hated this One Belt One Road, and the reason was now it became such a problem for us, and every local governments were doing it, and every think tanks were doing it, and there were like 11 research institutions named by One Belt One Road in Beijing alone. So it got really curious and said, well, with all these controversies, so we are talking about controversy in the United States. I tell you, in China, it was much more controversial. So I didn't stop my research on this, because I just want to know exactly, why you had this, and what was driving the proposal, and why so many cross-agency specialists and bureaucrats felt excited about this initiative, and what was really going on in terms of implementation. And so that was the driver of this project. And again, because the controversy sells, right? So I got a number of other grants, which forced me to continue my research on the Belt and Road. But essentially, my motivation of writing this was speaking to 3 very common perceptions of this initiative. And I'm not saying they were wrong, but I think they were very partial. So the first one, I think you guys would know more, because as a foreign policy specialist, one view is this One Belt, One Road was China's efforts to dominate the region, at least, if not the world, right? The global domination. And the second is it was Xi Jinping thing. And Xi Jinping, as the new chairman now in China, and wanted to do this crazy nationalist strategy. And the last one was this is going to cost China lots of money, and this will be such a waste of economic resources for political gains. So I guess like when I did my research, then I found that this all not being entirely true. So the first thing I found, so unpacking the process, right? So the first thing I found that was Xi Jinping, although publicized this the belt and then the road, but he was really responding to 3 very consistent and very concerted efforts that had been going on in China at least since 2008, and those actually directly led to the content, the concept, and the mutual connectivity, the Asian infrastructure investment banks. So the term they used before were almost identical from what they used in the Xi Jinping's speeches. And then you had this Chinese Marshall Plan, and so I just the sources, and the reason one thing I want to mention is when I was talking to these cross-agency folks, and they all wanted to claim that they were the main drivers, and so it's interesting to see that they in a way they did. So their practices actually led to that. So if that is a reflection, and if a Belt Road is a reflection to an ongoing Chinese policy and foreign and domestic policy strives, then what is implemented? So the second step I want to look at how China does this. Right, and how it does differently now. You have this top-down leadership. So, and we are talking about the opening the black box of China's top policy making. And so I kind of used all these, all the statements made by Xi Jinping and by all the leadership, to the 25 Politburo members, and then all the agencies and all the activities and the speeches on the One Belt One Road, and kind of studied exactly who were talking what and doing what on the Belt Road. So in the article, I can summarize at the leadership level, only 2 persons matters. One is Xi Jinping, not surprising, and he's not only proposing the ideas, but he also is doing the promotion. So no other agencies could be, or individuals could be involved in promotion. So all the projects that are on Belt Road abroad will be signed directly by Xi Jinping. And then in terms of agency, instead of if we're thinking of this as foreign policy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs should be heavily involved. Actually, they are not. And then if we're thinking of this as foreign economic policy, the Ministry of Commerce should be more involved. The Ministry of Commerce actually was also not much engaged in this process. So it's really the development and research Development and the Reform Council, the National NDRC in China. And the Belt Road Small Leading Group was led by the Chinese leader who long time specialized in regional economic planning. So that's where I come down to my assessment of the Belt Road that is more for re-energizing and reviving internal economic growth. So the linkages they do want to set up, but the linkages inside China are actually more central than the external one. So every time I hear 60 billion or 600 billion, now I don't even remember the numbers. I will put a bigger question mark on these numbers. So this article is very empirical, and then I kind of try to look at if Xi Jinping is this important, and the NDRC is also this. So I kind of go into the speeches, activities, and one comment on Xi Jinping. So in Washington, when people hear Xi Jinping talk, and the occasions are likely multilateral venues. So if that's the only occasion that you hear Xi Jinping's words on Belt Road, you would conclude this is a hollow, 假大空. It's all these very big, beautiful words without much substance. And so that was my finding on Xi Jinping's speeches on all these multilateral settings. It's all about the ideas that he tries to connect with Belt Road. But if we look at his talks in bilateral settings, like going to Hungary or going to a particular country, then the talks would be coupled with lots of economic projects and the bilateral treaties. And he also spoke to domestic audience, although the speeches are fewer, but it's actually much more substantive. For instance, he proposed a Silk Road Fund into domestic audience, not to the international audience. And he also asked all the local governments to put One Belt One Road in their 5-year plan. And that's big deal. So again, it's another evidence to show the Belt Road in the context of 2013 to 2015 was really picked up as a development strategy to revitalize China's industrialization and growth. So lastly, it's along the similar line, but I got to the implementation side. So I look at the financing mechanism and the Silk Road, the AIIB and the Silk Road Fund. I do not think these are main financiers of the Belt Road Initiative because AIIB, Xi Jinping proposed both in one speech. And he used them as the same instruments of BRI. But AIIB, because of its multilateral nature and because of the US was very angry with, well, not US, but lots of these development agents were unhappy with the United States. So they kind of jumped to help and shape and transform the AIIB into a transnational or multilateral institutions, and the AIIB's projects now they try to follow more or less international standards and partner with World Bank and the ADB. So this make it actually a quite good development in terms of multilateral development financing. But from the Chinese point of view, it also lost its instrumental value of being a policy instrument. So people also pay attention to the Silk Road Fund, but it's actually very, very small fund, and the mandate was very specific. So you're not going to get much traction from SRF, right? So the main financiers will be still the former development financiers in China, the Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank, and almost every commercial banks in China can be involved in the group banks. So you'll find banks in Xinjiang or banks in Hubei. Different local banks actually are involved in financing of some of the projects named in the name of Belt and Road. And so then looking at the reported in Belt and Road investment projects abroad, then I also kind of group them into different types, and and one set will be most ambitious, but those are really, to me, like hollow pledges. For instance, like the Southern Grids plan to set up electricity grids for all Eurasia countries, and that's not going to happen. And similarly with Guangdong nuclear, so there are, if people are kind of looking at these reported big ambitious plans, then you'll say, oh, that's not going to happen, or it's too ambitious. But that's just one set. And the second set of these investments, actually, I do believe follow the corporate business plans. So for instance, Baosteel's online commerce platform to sell steels online, or Southern Airlines headquarters in Malaysia. And so some of these investments actually would make sense from this company's business plan. And the last set, actually, I found just a continuous, the aid program from previous era. And so they have this Southeast Asian Fund, and now it's just converted into Maritime Silk Road Fund. It's continuous operation. So I would caution when we evaluate this policy moves, there are actually many things can be uncovered. It's not as grandiose as a sometimes sound, or as crazy as a most of the time sound, but it's also not meaningless. And so domestically, it's re-strategizing some of these connectivity projects, and externally, we also found, although in the early period of Belt and Road, I do not find much money flows. So if anything, actually 2014, 2015, 2016, we saw decline in China's outbound investment in these Belt and Road regions. So we don't see much money flows, but we do see the soft institutional building. So the Chinese branch offices were built, and there are lots of memorandum of understandings. So in short, so far, I think the drama is primarily inside China, and it's not in this article, but in my broader, bigger project, I have chapters on local government's interpretation and projects, and companies' interpretation and projects. So they are more detailed evidence to show that this strategy gets to mobilize Chinese economic actors into action, and leave these actors to self-interpret whatever projects that they think it makes sense for them. Yet, I do not believe this is meaningless, because if it really manages to stabilize Chinese economy and revive the Chinese economy, then there's the banks, the company, they will have more resources to go global, and that is shown in the 2007 data as. But the destination, then it's interesting. You'll find, although in South Asia, India is the non-Belt Road, the strongest opponent. Pakistan is the strongest component of Belt and Road. You guess which country gets more money? India. And the company that I interviewed, when they say I'm implementing Belt and Road in South Asia, they are investing in India. They're exploring business in India, not in Pakistan. Okay, I'll end here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ming, for excellent paper and a good discussion on the Belt and Road Initiative. I enjoy reading your paper so much. In my opinion, this is probably the best piece I have ever read on the literature on this BRI initiative. I guess your paper revised much of the conventional wisdom on this project. Lots of people have believed that the Belt and Road Initiative was engineered by Xi Jinping to use China's newly gained economic strength to serve China's global geopolitical objectives. And that's pretty much the argument of the second paper by William Norris in some way. And you convince us no, there is a domestic dynamics out there. It's primarily for releasing China's domestic overcapacity that the BRI came into being. And you explain very well how that program has been implemented, how it's financed, and much of the picture is quite different from what we have conceived in the past. It's very excellent. Before I open the floor to the audience for questions, I do have two minor questions for you. The first is about the overcapacity, which seems to be the point of departure for the government to conceive this project. And what exactly was overcapacities in China's manufacturing before the initiation of this project? How severe it is? And do you have some numbers to show us about the overcapacity? That seems to be taken for granted, but in my understanding, Chinese economy has been unfolding in such a way. There are a series of cycles. Each cycle involve a number of years. There is some it begins with increasing capacity, and then there is overcapacity, and then there is a recession. So it's not new to China. It has been out there several times. How come this round of time the overcapacity necessitated the BRI initiative? So this is one question for me. And the other is about how China's overseas investments and domestic projects influence or constitute the larger picture of BRI. Your paper talks a lot about domestic projects and investment in the interior provinces, and you just talked about the investment in India or Pakistan. So what exactly is the proportion of government investment outside China? Pakistan is an example. People are talking about the Sino-Pak economic corridor, which is supposed to be a huge scheme that involves hundreds of projects, and there are lots of Chinese projects in Africa and in Southeast Asia as well. So how the government deal with the two sides, overseas investments and the domestic projects? Your paper talks a lot about domestic investments, but missing from your presentation seems to be the proportion of the investment outside China.
Yeah, I'll quickly respond to this because I think that maybe this exactly something you'll be thinking. Number one is overcapacity in China is cyclical, and that's my argument as well. Because if you are an industrializing economy and dependent on external demand, and every time global recession leads to overcapacity in China, this is not the only time. The 1990s, if people pay attention to China's membership to WTO, the Western Development Program, and in the 1980s. So every round when overcapacity took place, there will be major response. In 2008, there was also major overcapacity, but they responded with a stimulus plan, and that is less strategic than these strategies. And the industrial report by Chinese institutions put together overcapacity in 2010 to 2012 was ranging from 30% to 50% for most of industry. That's very, very big number. But in the recent few years, the overcapacity did decline because many of the overcapacity industries were shut down. And the coal, the steel, the metal, lots of them were shut down. Now it's a different story. External projects. So I used all the reported projects on Belt Road. So the three types external project, the hollow pledges, the business expansion, and the aid programs were all reported as Belt Road projects abroad. And so my job is to tell actually there are only a few that are really external investment projects, and those were more in line with their pre-existing business plan. Right? So Alibaba's investments in India, and in Malaysia, there's a special economic zone in Malaysia. So and in Pakistan, the highway was so far the only completed project is a highway from Karachi to Lahore, but it may become a bigger. But I have to recheck a little bit, like the inside. So you do see a lot more inside investment flows and projects. That may be just showing that the Chinese local governments like to please. So most of the projects were actually pre-existing. Those were phrased. Because of the 2014 financial reform in China, they freezed all the local debts, problematic projects, and now with Belt Road and then the China Development Bank went to go through all these projects again, and some of them had the local governments financing and the local banks financing. Those got revived. So it's a reviving of some of the pre-proposed projects. Then lots of the roots of this was planted in 2008 to 2012, and that 4 trillion stimulus plan plus local stimulus plan was 9 trillion RMB. So like within 2 years, China spent 13 trillion RMB in stimulating the economy, and that creates lots of things. Thank you.
Okay, let's collect questions from our audience. 1, 2, 3. Let's begin with Josh.
You don't have to though.
Well,
this is a topic. Eric and I have been working on this topic for a while. So this is a topic that I was really excited to read the paper. So excited I actually read it first. And I agree with Huaiyin's comments. It really turned me on to this idea that at this point it's largely domestic. And that actually makes a whole lot of sense, right? Because for decades, the party has been stimulating growth through debt, right? And then writing off debt, and then giving more debt, and then right. So to some degree, this is the old song being played all over again, right? So we revert often to what we know best, and the debt-driven growth is the song that's been being played for a long time. So it's kind of not surprising that people take BRI and then fit it into the mold in a kind of path-dependent way of what they had been doing. But there are a couple of questions that come out of it, and kind of answer them going forward. Of course, this idea of that people always ask: is there any limit to this? Right? Can you, if you own all the banks and you own the police and you own the politics and you control it, can you write debt in infinitum? Like, at what point does this actually become a problem? Because people are showing these graphs of SOE debt growing quickly, right? And the question is, what does that matter? right? So I want you to kind of think about, in a country like China, are there different rules, right? And then if you take this debt, one thing that I was told this summer in Shanghai, at Fudan, was that China has begun to securitize this debt, right? And so for those of us in America may remember, you take a bad debt, you cut it up, you make it into a AAA bond, you sell it off, right? Not only was I told that, but I was also told they're selling it to the local governments and forcing the local governments to buy it. Okay, so what you're creating here is systemic debt crisis problem, right? If the debts go bad, then it ripples throughout the Chinese economy. And so the question then, I guess for you is this a serious problem? Has it been considered? It's certainly something I'd like to see you address, right? Because this issue of, okay, 3 words, financing, debt, and investment get confused way too much, right? Financing is both. Debt is debt, and investment is investment, right? And this is debt driven, and that's unique in a lot of ways. And so the question is, what does that mean in terms of risk? In terms of overcapacity, I'd like to see you talk about labor overcapacity as well. So we hear a lot about industrial overcapacity, capital overcapacity, but China has 30 million extra men, right? That's an overcapacity. It's a labor overcapacity. So if you're doing local projects, you're deploying local labor forces. So the capacity aspect actually goes further. I think you can make that argument even further than you've taken it. I'd also be curious on the politics side, when you put One Belt, One Road into the constitution of the party, then politically, does that mean that a party member who speaks out about One Belt, One Road in a negative way could face consequences in terms of party membership and other things? So what is the consequence of putting this initiative into the constitution, politically and also economically? As you said a moment ago, people were speaking very negatively about it. I found the same thing. It was hard for me to find somebody speaking positively. But that was before it was in the party constitution. Has this silenced, is this a line in the sand, or is it not? Are people still kind of whispering about the weapons of the weak, all right? Or are they not? Also, having been part of the China-Eurasia Forum in Xinjiang, there was a definite neo-imperial feel to what was going on, right? Foreigners getting up there one after another in a very kind of ritualistic way, appealing to the Chinese vision of themselves as leaders, and the Chinese sitting in big red chairs saying, right? And this kind of neo-imperial feeling in the room was just, it was really, and so what does that mean, right? From the perspective of the way China's dealt with developing countries in its periphery for its imperial period, is this, as some have said, a neo-imperial, not imperialist, but a neo-imperial strategy, intentionally or even unintentionally, that you slip into old methods of behavior, and that when you deploy something, you just kind of slip into that kind of a dynamic. And it's a difference when you do it intentionally or it just happens kind of by accident. Anyway, I really enjoyed it, and we can talk more about anything.
Should we ask more questions or answer one by one? So yeah, go ahead, please.
So I'll start with a prediction, which is not based just on the topic, but also on the quality of the scholarship. I think this will be the most cited paper in the volume. So it's just a terrific job. It's very rich, and there's just so much in it for all of us, I think. But and I guess this is more of a question, a selfish question. I'm just curious as to the answer rather than a suggestion that you necessarily put this into the paper. But first of all, I thought one of the many interesting aspects was the debate within China and sort of the nature of the pushback and critique of this approach, which again, it's a contribution to the literature. If you go back to the early stages of the going out strategy, and you look at how that was structured, remind me again, I think CSAC is part of NDRC, is that right?
CSAC is SASAC, right? It's not.
Okay, it's not. All right. In any case, the projects that were sponsored early, I mean, they were all upstream resource for the most part, but in any case, they were evaluated fairly closely on profit grounds, and when they failed to return a profit, there was pretty fierce criticism, and there were repercussions for the CEOs of those firms. And I guess I'm curious as to what the future of this is if it encounters failure. There's this pre-existing criticism, there are critiques. You know, do we get it? Not exactly a Trump-like reaction, but, you know, why are we spending this money at home? We just dumped $22 billion into Venezuela. Why are we dumping more there? Obviously, that's not, that investment wasn't part of One Belt, One Road. But in any case, what happens when it hits failure overseas, and what's your, you know, what's your appraisal of its staying power in the face of setbacks?
Okay, yeah, please go ahead.
To what extent does Belt and Road's involvement in the stands with their Muslim populations associate with the Muslim populations in Western China?
Yeah, yes, yeah, go ahead. Professor? Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, two little additions. I wonder on excess capacity. Part of excess capacity is simply having stuff stand around. Part of it is relative excess capacity. But China has too much of steel. Laos has too little steel. So expanding markets it not only sells the steel, but it opens up whole new dimensions of utility. The second thing is your question, Eric, that it seems to me it's not just a question of failing projects, it's a question of whether with all this new political emphasis from the top, it'll be safe to report a failure. Right. You know, whether or not it will become something like that Mao Zedong said in the Great Leap Forward, I feel like a bird in a glass house, I'm flying into walls I can't see. Well, they couldn't see them because nobody would dare report them. And that may be the same type of
or even if the problem's known, you may not be able to step back. You have to reinforce failure.
Right. Or this CIA in Vietnam in the late 60s when it was filing progress reports regularly.
Professor Zhao.
Yeah. One question here. In fact, for all the papers, because we try to understand domestic sources, domestic dynamics on the foreign policy front, especially on China-U.S. relations as the subject matter. So, on the One Belt, One Road initiative, how the domestic dynamics have been played out in the policy-making process, as someone mentioned earlier. For me, it's a totally failure, just like another Great Leap Forward project. How could such a big failure project gone so far in China? And what kind of political dynamics, what kind of economic dynamics, and what type of the political struggle and political power dynamics have played into the process? So I think those are the questions when we talk about domestic source of foreign policy making. Here is the One Belt, One Road, such a huge now central piece of Xi Jinping's foreign policy and big power policy. Name it, all those things have centered on this piece of foreign policy. So how do you tell the whole story of the domestic dynamics here for failure? For a fail, for me, is a white elephant on the road. When Xi Jinping is gone, the whole thing will be gone. But China has invested so much. This is something that's not when people study going forward. Eventually, have to answer these questions. So,
yeah, we have enough questions for Professor Ye.
Yeah. The many very good points, and I'll just select a few to give my comments. Number one, I think criticism of Belt and Road actually is very tolerated in China, not in the sense of criticizing the vision or the China's need to go global more effectively. The principle. So in China, it's autocracy, but actually you can criticize them very freely, but you get to do it more tactfully, right? So the most of criticism actually are by high up people who are doing the projects, the criticism will be China has no experience and foreign contexts are so different, but it doesn't mean that China should go global and do it more effectively. So Xi Jinping only takes the credits for this directional grand strategy that China needs to do better overseas, and this works for the long-term national power of China, and that actually I think it's a quite common consensus by the government, the ruling elites in China. But criticism or difficulties is totally tolerated, and as a scholar or personal opinion, actually I welcome to read these difficulties on the Belt and Road Initiative. Right? And that's because it's precisely Chinese system, it's autocracy. If things go smoothly, there will be no check. But if there are difficulties, like the hydropower program in Pakistan experienced difficulty and it was passed, great. And this actually will reflect back to the policy making process. And I think there is so Eric and Josh, when you ask about the state capital, they are both are true. They have lots of access to government fund, but they are also under lots of pressure to deliver returns. All the money they invest abroad as a whole, they have to make sure the return rate of 5%. And that as represented in their interpretation of the Belt and Road, is that they are very risk averse. So there's again, I think there's a common misunderstanding that because you have this top-down program, so you kind of get lots of free money. But actually, there's not free money, because the central government told them got to find the bankable projects, bankable, and even the concessional loans, they charge 2%, and the 2% is higher than concessional loans provided by Japan. So in short, the SOEs actually are highly risk averse. That's why when they look for markets, they look for Malaysia, Thailand, India, places that actually, and Vietnam, and so places that complements with market expansion from China. And domestic project is a separate issue, because we are dealing with labor surplus as well. So you can have all the things shut down using market efficiency, but politics will not allow. So that's where, when you go to the local, then some of the projects got revived precisely because they are lifelines to the local governments. I don't think there's easy solution to this, because some of the places you cannot just dump them, right? I think it's kind of a cost that they have to shoulder to make sure that the stability is maintained for a new round of growth to solve the problem. So there are dealing with capacity, there are different ways, and I think the Chinese, so considering 2008, they dealt with a crisis using the stimulus plan. I think that was a much worse choice than a hollow and yet kind of mobilizing strategy by Xi Jinping. And I truly believe Hu Jintao lost the last of his credibility by doing that stimulus plan. In Xinjiang, actually I was in Xinjiang, so in my book I have prologue, and it's precisely my trip in Urumqi. I think you are perhaps right, and you will find some of these problems in ethnic tension increasing, because in order to ensure Xinjiang's the development the Xinjiang local governments are very ambitious. They now really target to become a frontier of growth. So they have to use hyper security measures to ensure stability, and that really creates ethnic problems. And if you are looking at this Central heads meetings, you perhaps can see some of in fact, the Xinjiang head was quite condescending to me as well. So it may not do necessarily to the foreigners. So I don't study this as ethnic problems. I also do not see this as I see it has lots of problems, but it's kind of a reaction to the crises that they are dealing, and like everything in China, they deals with one crisis and then creates another, and then they'll lead to a new set of tension, contradiction. But I guess that's my way of my communist inkling coming in. The Marxism and the contradiction is a perpetual life of politics.
All right. Yeah. More questions. Beginning with you.
Thank you. So I think this is more of a question/comments, and I think. So I was thinking exact question that raised by Professor Zhao, about why this project being hollow and fragmented and failure, but still get lots of attention, especially even more so in the past year. So I think I understand this is more of a economically driven paper, but I think some of the answer may lie into some political reason, being, for example, why Silk Road, why Road and Belt, why this title? Because a lot of these infrastructure projects were started over 10 years ago, but why now kind of put them into this umbrella of Belt and Road Initiative? So I think it also has something to do with mobilizing people's kind of sentiment about returning back to the glorious China, and when China was being so confident and powerful when the ancient Silk Road was prosperous. So there might be some of those political or nationalistic reason behind that to kind of support this pragmatic project, but still it's there. And another question, I think this, I guess. None of us have a very definite answer, but maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about the implication about to what extent is this initiative is Xi's personal legacy, especially now that is written into the party charter, and so to what extent it would help this project sustain if Xi leaves the office 5 years later, although he may not leave the office. It's just another kind of implication that you can talk a little bit about.
Yeah, back to you. Yes, please. Yeah, yes.
Thanks very much. I'm really struck by the dialogue, and particularly Sui Sheng's remarks about failure, that the Belt and Road is a failure. That would be big news in Washington. And so I just wanted, there's just a disconnect here. If I know there's a lot of discussion about this in the weaknesses of the Belt and Road, but your paper goes into the granularity of it, shows it much more clearly than these debates that are going on. The debates are very vague. And just to give you an example, at the National Bureau of Asian Research, I'm in charge of a project dealing with Russia and China. And there isn't that much interest in Russia and China. It's remarkable. We go around and read policymakers and they're not that interested. But we joined it up with our Belt and Road project. And so there's a publication by Belt and Road, and it's mainly about the vision of the Belt and Road, but it's a very good summary of that. And we, at the NSC, at the Defense Department, at the State Department, I'm speaking, nobody's ever, and Nadesh starts speaking, they're all taking notes, and so they don't know this. They really don't know this. This is really news. That's what I'm getting at. I mean, this is striking. And so if the article, if the editors say, "Look, darn it, this thing is very weak," and has lots of weaknesses in it and lays it out clearly, that would be a tremendous contribution. I mean, I just think the community in Washington is very interested in the subject and very muddled on how to think about it.
I just finished one article that all are wrong, and by all I sent the article to you.
Okay.
And also I presented that in China. One of these people said, "Oh, wow, can I get that people right away? We'll send to Xi Jinping."
Yeah.
Because it's, for them, it's everything success.
Yeah. But I just think, I mean, if you have this, I mean, your article, the one I've read, has that, it proves it. It lays it out very well. And so that's what I'm getting at. And so we can, so it's just the policy relevance, importance of it. I mean, I just think it's very policy relevant. And timely, very timely.
Actually, I forgot to speak to Professor Zhao's comments, and I reminded me that I will do that. Again, my evaluation of it's not a failure. It's not failure not because there's no problems. There are, but it achieved its mobilization purpose, and it allows the government to mobilize Chinese actors to deal with a very major economic crisis that they are facing. It will last at least during Xi, but even after Xi, because it really captures lots of the ideas of Chinese bureaucracies. Scholars are thinking about China, and it's about China's role in the world. And to give you a very simple analogy that I've been writing a lot on the Western Development Program, right? It started by Jiang, but Jiang came down, and then Hu came, and then Xi came, and all these 15 years, the Western Development Programs are still one of the top of program, but the contents have changed a lot. So that's what I call Belt and Road, Western Development, and China Goes Global. The similar kind, you know, it's ambiguous, and it allows you reinterpret and you bring in. So it's kind of coalition building, and it then comes down to the domestic politics. So I think the value is really in the domestic politics side. In our domestic politics, there are two views on China. One is the state, you know, what kind of state it is. So the Belt and Road process really demonstrates the Chinese state system was so fragmented, and it was like so fragmented, and it could not come up with one single response acceptable to other agencies. So Belt and Road, they offered autocratic intervention into a fragmented state, and was enabling the state to respond with a cohesive policy. The second key point that we in China domestic policy is the central system, and then the local, and then the government and the business interaction. I studied Belt and Road really like using this as a venue to observe very interesting interactions between the central policy and the local dynamics, as well as the state and business and interpretation. So in short, I do see this as more a domestic project than external. But in fact, it will be it will be very hard for Xi to see this as a failure. Now there's a lot of things that they can bring under the bracket of the Belt and Road, but the autocratic system, again, my last point is autocratic system. If you want to transform it, or you want it to do good things, not by giving them more money, but giving them less money, and also not by appeasing, but by critiquing. So I see this is because compared to the stimulus plan and Belt and Road, we haven't seen the fallout of these debt financed investments, because the Chinese government had no more money, so they didn't have as much money, and they were not able to really give the banker, the state capital unlimited access to fund. And second is it was really because being so watched, and it was criticized, so they were careful to be more disciplined and make it very clear, and all the projects moving forward follow market principle and company-led, market-led. This was, and she basically determined that would be the mechanism. But this, as foreign policy, will not see the grandiose impacts, but the instrumental value is there, I do think.
Yeah, one more question. Yes, Professor Warman.
I really liked your paper and your emphasis on domestic roots of the policy. In part because I've been watching this between Guangxi and Vietnam for the last 20 years. They've been trying to develop better relationships, and that involves connectivity, and that's been, moderately successful through trial and error over the time. But it also occurs to me that if we look at the big picture of Belt and Road, we have to consider China's internal connectivity and internal and local relationships to the outside as vital parts, because essentially Belt and Road is an attempt to build to recenter Asian connectivity on China, inclusive, so not just China and bilateral or China and region, but out to other places. And that recentering of Asia makes sense with China's location, population, and productivity, which are the reasons that China was so important in Asia in the pre-modern times as well. So, it's not just a question of policy or current state policy. It's also a question of China's location and adjustment of its strategy to the advantage of having 14 neighbors instead of the disadvantage.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't think yeah, go ahead.
What I find most striking about this paper, like everyone else, is this utilitarian picture you painted about this initiative. China is using this to export overcapacity. But I feel it's currently a little bit there in the lead in the paper. I think it's worth playing out more. Right now, you have at the beginning of the paper, you listed 3 motives. So diplomatic motive, this economic motive, which I find the most striking, and then the strategic motive. So I think it will make an interesting paper even more interesting to play up this part in the framing. And also, besides these 3, I think I also have I think of another motive that I think it relates to the diplomatic and the strategic, and you mentioned about it, I'm sure somewhere, but I think it's worth being singled out. So the shipping route, it's strategic. So China is either building a shipping route from with the South China Sea being disputed, Malacca Strait being overcrowded. So it's vitally important for China to have another route, an alternative route, either through India to the Gwadar port or through Laos and Cambodia, which they are building high-speed railways right now. So this being strategic and also diplomatic, strengthening the interconnectivity, I think it's different. So maybe it's worth being singled out as a different motive.
Any responses?
I'm more kind of inductive researcher. So I only found the 3, but the shipping routes I know that became after. So when the Belt Road came out, and then the energy ministry already had the pre-existing the pipelines, and then the kicker was doing studies on on the alternative shipping routes, and that actually led to several research institutions in China focusing on the maritime Silk Road, how that generates alternative routes. But it's after the Belt Road Initiative. So from that, it only gets to the point that the more central point is that the Belt Road, the direction or the effort that they try to do actually captures a number of coexisting, ongoing things in China. So that's why people genuinely, in 2014, genuinely feel excited about this.
All right, I guess we have to stop here. The paper. Let's move to the second paper. And the author is Mrs. Lauren Dickey, and she is a PhD candidate in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London, and the National University of Singapore. Her research examines the Chinese strategic tradition towards Taiwan, with a particular focus on the late Hu Jintao and early Xi Jinping years. And her paper is titled, it's about the politics, assessing the CPC's political mandate for Xi Jinping. Please.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining this afternoon, to Josh for meeting in Shanghai and looping me in, to Sam for co-organizing, and then the wonderful folks in the back that have made sure we've all gotten here and have been well fed today too. So I am, much like Minya, I'm looking at an issue from within China and addressing how it looks out. But I'm going to start from, well, really my whole argument centers upon politics rather than upon economics. What I've tried to do in my paper is to shift the discussion away from really the personality cult that has formed around Xi Jinping and the discussions of his strongman leadership style, to focus more on what I argue to be the heart of the matter, which is the relationship between the party and its top leader. Though it's perhaps more colorful or exciting to kind of postulate how Xi Jinping's background in Shanghai or in Xiamen influences his policy, my argument can essentially be condensed down to a recognition that it is the party with a capital P and party politics that matters most in understanding how China looks outward today. So there's obviously dozens of different ways to look at how the party defines the scope of the leader's policy decisions and the trends in Chinese policy more broadly. But in the context of my paper, I've operationalized my analysis and argument by examining the case of Taiwan, which is obviously the core of my PhD as well. I use Taiwan to highlight what the broader political and party framework says, what the CPC has defined it as, how Taiwan fits into this framework since 2012, and what the implications for policy are. To kind of really sum up things very shortly, and I obviously went on at great length in my paper about this, the policy toward Taiwan operates in this kind of cosmos that's designed and defined from start to finish by the CPC. In other words, the CPC acts as the ways, means, and ends for the leadership. The task of the General Secretary and President, and I argue that the General Secretary of the party is a much more important title than the presidency. So for Xi as General Secretary, his task, first and foremost, is to orient the political elite and broader populace around a guiding ideology, the ways of strategy and statecraft that drives toward the CPC's near and long-term goals. These goals, or the ends of policy, can be broadly understood as the dual centenary goals, which I actually don't think we've talked about today, but for anyone that's not a China person in the room, these are the goals in the 2020s and late 2040s, early 2050s of essentially modernization, prosperity, and national rejuvenation. So those are the ends. The means within this political framework then are the tools of statecraft available within the party state system for Xi Jinping as General Secretary and President to use in his execution of policy. So that's the political framework. The question then in my research that I've tried to answer is, where does Taiwan fit into all of this? Taiwan is actually but a small piece in a much larger political puzzle. The task for the leadership is not simply how to achieve the long-sought goal of reunification, but how to do so in a manner which serves the political mandate of the CPC and the broader national objectives, those 2 centenary goals I just mentioned. Defining what this path looks like requires the leader to carefully manipulate ideology and rhetoric in a manner that supports the party's mandate, delineated in the work reports of the 18th Party Congress in 2012 and the 19th Party Congress in 2017. So kind of in contrast to Minya, who's looking at economic indicators and economic policy and how that's trickled down really from the central to the local level for the Belt and Road, I look at core state documents and how those are interpreted and operationalized by the political elite. So to start with the 18th Party Congress, the work report issued by the outgoing Hu Jintao government in 2012 is very much what I see as a legacy document. So when Xi Jinping entered office, he was given this political mandate to tackle all the problems that Hu could not solve, that Hu either didn't have the political capital to solve or that he did not have the time, frankly, to get to tackling. So she was able to tackle governance and economic reforms and seize power, consolidate power in the way that he was because the party wanted him to do so. I think it's less a debate of how strong he as a person was and more of a debate on, and more of an issue really, on sustaining the party for the future. And the party wanted a strong leader to be able to orient the party around its own survival. With regards to Taiwan then, Xi's initial task centered upon ensuring progress towards the goal of reunification did not distract or deter from this much bigger and broader agenda of political and economic reform. So Taiwan then became bundled into Xi's national vision of the China Dream. And following the 2014 Sunflower Movement, it was bundled once again into this vision of a community of common destiny, the Mingyun Gongtongti. Both of these, I think, really reflected a belief that a strong and prosperous China is something that's shared by the people on both sides of the strait. And this very much fell on empathetic ears in Taiwan during the Ma Ying-jeou presidency, but obviously did not last forever. And with Xi Jinping as his first term has played out, looking back, there was obviously a very clear turning point in 2016 when Tsai Ing-wen was elected in Taiwan, and it became this external threat both to the party's political mandate as well as to these broader goals of national rejuvenation and reunification that were at the very core of Xi Jinping's agenda. So then understanding kind of how Xi Jinping was moving forward, I argue that we have to look towards the 19th Party Congress and that work report to understand how the mandate from the CPC has changed and what it means for Xi Jinping and how he's operationalized the party's vision vis-a-vis Taiwan. The most significant difference from 18th Party Congress to 19th Party Congress I see as 2 main elements. So first you have the inclusion of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Yes, that is one phrase. And the explicit statement of the centenary goals and the China Dream included within the work report. Previously, they had just been alluded to rather than explicitly stated. So Xi Jinping really means business. But again, I argue in my paper that he means business because the party really wants to achieve these goals. They see this as, centenary goal. The first one is just around the corner. And so they need a strong, capable leader to drive the nation and the party toward these goals. Xi has asserted his prerogative at the 19th Party Congress and ever since as the highest political authority to reshape and ideologically reorient the country in pursuit of these national objectives. And really the party has initiated and supported his ability to do so from the 18th Party Congress. The confidence that Xi has established with regards to the party's future trickles down into a similar toughness into how Taiwan is addressed in the 19th Party Congress work report. So I break down some of the different formulations that are used in 2 tables or charts within the paper. And with the 19th Party Congress, though some of the formulations are not new, for instance, the 6 Nis, the Liuge Renhe, were introduced in November of, I believe, 2016, vis-a-vis Hong Shouju when she visited Beijing. The difference with 19th Party Congress and how Xi Jinping has crafted this party mandate towards Taiwan is that much of the language is stronger toward the DPP administration than in any past instance. In other words, Xi Jinping is operationalizing this party mandate in a way that is much more assertive towards the DPP under Tsai than the DPP under Chen Shui-bian. So with the DPP in office and the two centenary goals fast approaching, I understand these shifts as reflecting the gravity and urgency of maintaining stability and control along the Chinese periphery in order to drive towards these much bigger political goals. So much like at the 18th Party Congress, though there have been minor fluctuations in language and policy, of course, to accompany that, Taiwan's fate is actually subsumed to a macro level political agenda that is dictated by the CPC and executed by Xi Jinping himself. I think I'm going to try and wrap up because I actually really want to get feedback on this more than anything else today. But my bottom line really in this paper is that the party is trying to retain its position as alpha and omega of the Chinese nation. In this context, Xi Jinping is not just the party's leading man, but he's also the very manifestation of the party itself. Each policy initiative on Taiwan, no matter how small, fits into a much larger narrative on how China is to reach the centenary goals. Though the post-19th Party Congress path is still a work in progress, the task ahead is to watch how the politics and the relations between Xi and the party, rather than purely personality traits, shape the future. So if we're to look beyond Taiwan, I think probably the biggest implication of my paper and my research more broadly is that Chinese policy decisions always fit into a much broader political structure that is set by the CPC rather than one individual person. And that is key to analyzing why the party does what it does, it makes the decisions it does, and then ultimately what our US policy towards China looks like can be based on this understanding.
Yeah, go ahead.
In terms of leadership politics in the making of Chinese foreign policy, in fact, we just published several articles. I just see how you respond to these arguments. One article is by Zhang Xinming from Dickey University. He argues that the personality of the leaders in China are very important for the making of Chinese foreign policy. The leadership personality he divided into crusaders type. Here we talk about Xi Jinping, talking Mao Zedong, and last crusader kind of accommodative type, receptive to the new information, and more adaptive type. So these different personalities have played a very important role in China's foreign policy making process. Another paper by Huaiyin at Hong Kong U, he tries to compare Xi Jinping with Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. Here he borrowed the concept of talking about US presidential politics, that is transformational leader versus transactional leaders. Xi Jinping is a more transformational leader, and Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin are more transactional leader. Therefore, we see two different foreign policy orientations in China in the last several decades. Another paper talking about China foreign policy in terms of three periods. One is Chinese foreign policy 1.0 Mao's foreign policy, that is revolutionary foreign policy. Chinese foreign policy 2.0 is Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy, which is reform and development foreign policy. And the third is the Chinese foreign policy 3.0, big power diplomacy. Xi Jinping's foreign policy emphasizes China is powerful. China now has the capacity to reach its dreams. So in that context of personality differences and change of foreign policy orientation, so how do you see your argument here, party versus the leader, in the making of foreign policy here, in particular making Taiwan policy fit all different from those arguments in the literature here now?
Any other questions? Yes, Kathy.
Okay. Laura, I really enjoyed reading your paper, and so I understand your argument, and I kind of thinking about like why sort of like it's the party rather than the leaders that is central to your argument. So as I was reading your paper and listening to your presentation, so I kind of hear two stories. Like one is because of the Taiwan problem, which is the core interest of China, and that is why like no matter who comes to the office, that they cannot make too much deviation from the fundamental policy. So this is the first story. And the second one, and I think that was mentioned during your presentation, is that is it because the previous leader, like Hu Jintao, was too weak? So now this time, the party needs a stronger leader, and that's why the party sort of chose Xi Jinping. So it's kind of like, maybe both of them are true, so I just kind of want to, like, maybe you can kind of flesh out these, but to me, these are the two different stories, whether it's issue-based, or whether it's just kind of like they need party needs a stronger leader now, because it used to be too weak previously. So that's kind of my thought from Ron.
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
So I share your views on Xi Jinping a lot. I was thinking, so every leader, no matter how strong, they have limited capacity. So they have to prioritize things. To me, Xi Jinping seemed to prioritize Hong Kong as more urgent issue than Taiwan. Do you, in your research, do you also kind of look at his policy over Taiwan, over Hong Kong, and whether that signals like this is a part that he wants to leave some?
May I add one more comment following Professor Zhao's question? I guess personality does matter. You're looking at the different leaders in the past few decades, from Jiang through Hu Jintao now to Xi Jinping, you can find clear differences among them. Xi is very different from the preceding two leaders in his assertiveness, his confidence in his leadership or his personal power, and these combined with the growing military capacities, I guess there is a stronger tendency or inclination for the current administration to take more aggressive steps in dealing with Taiwan. And there are a few key points that people are concerned with. Xi is talking about China Dream, which is actually very specific. That he has two 100 years objective. One is one objective is targeted the year 2021. That's the 100th anniversary of the CCP's establishment. And the other is 2049. That's the 100 years anniversary of the PRC. So I guess Xi Jinping, being such an ambitious person, would have something in his mind, what China is going to finish by these two key points. Unification is one of the big objectives in his mind, I guess. And so I guess the cross-strait tensions during his administration would be much more intense than in the past. But how that tension develops to a point as to entail an outbreak of cross-strait war, we don't know. But I guess this is a very interesting point to watch. And yes, Josh.
Oh, do you want
to think? I just feel like there's misunderstanding of Jiang being a softie or the wars in South China Sea over Taiwan were fought during Jiang. I mean, we all have this image of Xi Jinping being this hostile, assertive, but we haven't seen militarized. There are militarized moves led by Xi. Jiang, in fact, fought. So I guess like perception and then real policy are quite different things.
Yeah, Josh.
So a couple of questions. You know, you have there, she's the man of the party, but could we not say that the party is Xi Jinping's, right? I mean, what does it gain us by saying that she's the party man rather than the party is Xi's, right? What causal leverage does that afford us, right? So that was a question I kept asking, you know, as Xi has purged the party, right? Maybe Xi's power comes from the CPC, that's true, but Xi has also purged the hell out of the CPC worse than maybe any other leader, I don't know, maybe even worse than Mao Zedong himself, right? So hasn't Xi made the party his own in that way? And so while I agree that initially the party chose Xi, but now Xi is putting his imprimatur in ways that are really historic. And then this concept that you deal with in the paper of the party, I want you to tease that out more, because the party is made by its members, right? So the party is not some amorphous organization, it's made up of a group of people. And in this case, when we're talking about leadership succession, high politics, we're talking about a selectorate, a very small group of people, maybe big enough to fit in this room, right? So when we're talking about the party, what we're not talking about is, you know, my father-in-law who joined the party because he teaches elementary school and he had to join in order to be a principal, right? That's not who we're talking about. We're talking about a very select group of party members who are at the real elite levels. So I wonder if you can put a little bit more explanation as to why make Xi a man of the party at this point, given the purging, and explain to me, help us to better understand the concept of the party and how we can tease that out from just a selectorate of elites at the top.
Should we stop here and then invite more questions after you finish?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably.
Follow it.
Is it follow? Okay. Add on.
Oh, okay. Let me follow on this. Another literature I think you might want to consider is the institutionalization literature versus disinstitutionalization literature. Because during Hu Jintao's years, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao years, there was a very big literature on how Chinese political system, elite politics, has become institutionalized. And these office holders are more of office, the authority come from the office instead of from their personal authority. And the roles, the collective leadership, all you talk about became important and even institutionalized. But we see last 5 years, totally opposite. The institutionalization process not only stopped by Xi Jinping, but reversed by Xi Jinping. His personal authority, his personal power is much more overwhelming over institutionalization process. So for me, and also people looking at institutionalization literature, is a shock. How can China, in such, I mean, we started a 10, 20, 30 years process, build institutionalization process, overnight collapse. So how this type of changes, this type of development help us to understand foreign policy making process in China, impact on the Taiwan policy making process, on the policy making of the United States, and South China Sea, Japan. So many issues are linked to this institutional change, institutional environment in China. So I don't know if you have taken that literature into consideration.
You're going to answer.
Yeah.
We have another round of questions.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of pick and choose. I'll start with institutionalization versus deinstitutionalization. Actually, I would probably push back gently. I don't think it's collapsed overnight, the institutionalization. I think why we're seeing Xi consolidate power and his ability to really redirect around this China dream is because that institutionalization has held up to a certain point. I think we're seeing a different form of institutionalization and how that's explained in the current literature.
He's brought into office by the process.
Right.
He came out, totally.
I think he's making the process stronger.
Just opposite, I was arguing.
Okay. Well, I'll have to dig in the literature.
Institutionalization. What are some things that she kind of stopped?
Now, for example, 4个意识, 核心意识, that everything is around himself, one person.
Yeah, so they added a lot of the
laws
ideas.
Totally changed collective leadership. Totally disappeared.
So perhaps the more interesting question coming from that then would be Josh's point about like the difference between is she the party or is the party she? And
it doesn't matter.
Does it matter, right? Why does it matter? What causal leverage does this afford us? I like bolded that in my notes. I mean, I would say that it does matter, and this also gets to the kind of other question that's come up about to what extent does personality matter. I personally believe that it's really hard for us to interpret how and why personality matters. Just simply because, and there's a lot of literature on this, especially that's rooted in Westerners studying Western leaders. How do you know that, for instance, Jervis does this, the Hermans do this. How do you know that like one individual leader, because he or she was raised in a democracy and values freedom of speech, that that's the way that they shape all of their policy initiatives around this one human right? I think it's really hard to say that because they have value X or experience Y, that that's what determines policy Z. And Xi Jinping, to me, is like case in point, because we really don't know what's going on in Xi Jinping's head. And this paper stems from like almost a sheer frustration with the obsession in Washington, D.C. right now to try and understand what the personality cult of Xi Jinping looks like and why it's Mao 2.0. So sorry to like rant a little bit for a moment on that, because I really think that we are just so obsessed with personality that we're losing the fact that there's this really important dynamic between the party and Xi. To come back to Josh's question, which is where I stepped away there, the causal leverage that this affords us, if we can make sense of what the party wants of Xi, then we can understand, I think, why Xi is doing what he's doing.
And who is the party?
The party in this case, right? So, like, how do I piece apart?
All the Politburo.
Right, but is it all the Politburo or just the standing committee? Is it like 2 people within the standing committee, or you know, like that's a black box that I am definitely not prepared.
I saw the 7 Politburo standing meeting by members at the dinner. Everybody just followed Xi Jinping. He stopped with the Nissan car. Everybody stopped.
Yeah.
They walked. Everybody walked. Followed him. So kind of personal, so different from 5 years ago.
But if they didn't, they'd all run into each other.
Yeah. He was
Think of your contrary hypotheses.
So this also goes with this idea that you have leaders who have power and then leaders who are vessels of the power of others, right?
Yeah.
And so it seems that you've got a group of people that Sam was talking about who are not really powerful but have become vessels where Xi Jinping chooses them because of their loyalty, and then they're you know, loyal, walking up, stopping, and whatnot. But I think that's also what he means, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, by a deinstitutionalization, right? That before, these might have been people with real power, people like Zhou Yongkang, who could tap the president's phone and do all types of stuff. But do they still have that power? Maybe from our outsider's perspective, we don't know, but it would seem by their parodying behaviors that they've lost a measure of that ability to say no, right? Who's going to say no to Xi Jinping? Whereas Hu Jintao, it seemed people were willing to push back on him.
So looking at current Politburo Standing Committee members, seven people, every of them, almost every of them, is yes man, Wang Huaiyin, all those people.
There's a lot of laughing.
So just to weigh in here, at great danger to myself since I'm not qualified, but you know, again, it does come back to your definition of institutionalization and deinstitutionalization. You're, I think, speaking at the party level, and I think if we look at individual policy areas, the institutions, the processes, and what Minier looked at, you know, in terms of the way that the Belt and Road, the way that it operates, the way that investments overseas operate. You know, when I looked at military policy, you know, we can very clearly see that the legacy of institutionalization is still very much in place. You know, the system operates very, very differently than it did under Mao or even under Deng, because it took a long time to set it in place. Now, obviously, at the political level, Xi has certainly established, you know, his power in a way that others haven't. But you would have to define institutionalization, I think. And, I think the picture is a little more mixed than you're suggesting, and I'm kind of sympathetic to Lauren's pushback, up to a point anyway.
Yeah, I have a few more words, in response to your, both of your comments about the institutionalization or deinstitutionalization. I guess, Xi Jinping so far, he's still actually within the scope that has been defined by his predecessors, when it comes to exercising his power, on different fronts. One thing that separates Xi from many other leaders is that now he creates so many small leading groups, and he turned himself into the head of those leading groups. But such small leading groups have been there in the history of the PRC. He just created more, and thereby consolidate his personal power. But nevertheless, that's still reinvention or continuation of a tradition that has been out there. Even in his recent invention of a new term, the Xi Jinping thought of Chinese socialism with socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era. Again, that's another version of the three represents, or the scientific outlook of development. He just want to left imprint in the history of the CCP. But I agree that he's much more powerful, more assertive, and his personalities are very different from the preceding.
The ultimate test will be if Xi Jinping could be the third term or fourth term.
That's exactly
the ultimate test.
But nevertheless, there have been discussions, when people are talking about the new 7 standing members of the Politburo. There have been rumors that Wang Qishan, who is older than 67,
chairman of National People's Congress.
But nevertheless, there have been rumors that Wang Qishan
identity institutionalization.
That's
a job slot from institutions. So now they can change that overnight.
But nevertheless, he did not enter the standing political bureau. That convinced me. He still adhered to the conventions that has been established. But yes, we're watching to see could he extend his tenure to the third term in the years. Yeah, Professor Mohammed.
It seems to me that what we're really talking about is public personification of power. And that I wonder to what extent, and I think that this could actually be researched, to what extent the party's experience with Bo Xilai and the long-term concentration of top leadership on how to deal with Bo Xilai played in thinking that not only was a stronger leader in the sense of being able to make policies and also to break people was necessary after Hu Jintao, but also there has to be, the party's institutional head has to take over this sense of personal leadership, like Bo Xilai was running in a kind of competitive basis. And it would be interesting to look at Xi Jinping's earlier positions and see if he was behaving like a little brother Bo Xilai, was behaving as a personality trying to aggrandize the appearance of power, like Bo Xilai was in Dalian and Chongqing.
Could I come back actually? So there was an interesting question that came out of your two comments, Sam and Professor Lee, about, I guess, and again, this is kind of like one of the motivating issues for me in digging into this angle that I did, is understanding the scope of Xi Jinping's power and how sustainable it is or isn't, right? Because you have him creating all these leading small groups. You have him amassing a dozen or so titles within the first couple years of coming into office. But how can he sustain all of this within the party state system? He is one person with an incredible advisory team, but there's only 24 hours in a day. And so I guess for me, and this is something that perhaps I can fold in or is another paper, I don't know, but his ability to sustain it is because of this demand that the country needs to be sustained, as does the party's ability to govern the country. And he's able to dictate and use the institutionalized relationships to pass off some of his responsibility. But I think there's a much bigger issue, at least from your 2 points, about, how is this, she's the party, the party's she, how is it sustained going forward? Can it be sustained, whether it's beyond, the next party Congress or in 50 years even?
Maybe there's just on this very issue, maybe we're kind of talking past each other a little, because it seems that Sam is talking a little bit about this idea of institutionalization of leadership change, institutionalization of political power. Whereas it seemed like you were talking a little bit about institutionalization of institutions, of policy making. And these two things actually could be happening simultaneously and non-conflictually. You could have a very institutionalized set of bureaucracies. At the same time, you could have a policy-making apparatus in which the institutional rules are framed. And so it's not necessarily that you guys are even, I think both could be true.
On that issue, I think Mike Lambert has an argument about 2 levels of the game. At the strategic level and non-regular, emergency, those are issues for national security policies. Those are the domain of top leaders. Especially here, talking about one person, because he is mostly in charge of the national security, and he is supposed to be not even first among equals, but is at the top. So on those issues are the prerogative, the domain of leadership politics. But below that level, at the routine policy making, for example, nuclear policy making and disarmament, all those issues, those are routine policy at that level for military and foreign military establishment and defense industry, all those kind of establishments, they are getting together through those small leadership groups or some other interagency type of institutional process to make decisions. So there are 2 levels. That top now becomes, as she mentioned that, I also agree with that. Jinping has only 24 hours, as we all have, but he seems to have got into so many issues. It's so amazing now. And basically, looking like whatever he wants to get involved, he got involved. Nobody will resist that. So that's the problem here. He has only 24 hours. As anyone else, he's not supposed to get into so many issues, but he got into.
But has he gotten into them though, or has he just symbolically gotten into them? Because I think there's also a difference there too.
Yeah, so gotten into them or controlled them. That's right. So if we go back to the small leading groups, you can be the head of a small leading group that has ostensible control over an issue area, but in some cases that basically means a veto power over major decisions, but it doesn't mean the power to implement, the power to oversee, the power to really establish detailed rules or anything like that. So this is a discussion of levels. And
I look at all the leadership, small leadership meeting agenda. You look at those agendas, you'll be really amazed, because I thought we only discussed that major issues, but they discuss all those trivial issues, like overseas Chinese national and citizenship, like all those. I never thought of that level, but they are discussed at those levels. It's so amazing to me.
And one thing to add to that is that if there was a major policy change that was announced by someone other than Xi Jinping, people would ask, so why isn't he announcing it? The whole question of public personality leadership, regardless of how the decision is.
Yeah, so if we talk about Xi Jinping's strong leadership, we really cannot separate the process from Hu Jintao and Bo Xilai and Jiang Zemin, because the 10 years of those 3 heads, China, it really destroyed the party state apparatus and the capacity. So to me, like Xi Jinping come in, taking over the vacuums left out by the local leadership. And the very fact that he needs to be leading every functions which do not do much, that is indication of the weakness of the state, the system, rather than because you and then bottom down, and then you look at the things that actually got done. It's all already being pushed by other functional bureaucracies or key interest groups. So I guess to me, like as a foreign policy, the power is about making people do things without yourself doing things, right? And she is sitting there, and in fact, the only obligation that he made that will be implemented is not China Dream or the rejuvenation things. It is an anti-poverty commitment, and that is tied to the growth rates. So I still, as a development specialist, I still think China today as the fastest growing economy in the world, its top priority is to continue to bring growth so that it has enough revenue to fulfill this party commitment. All the others, it's a vague, non-obligatory commitment. So
on the Taiwan issue, they will have another central work conference on Taiwan issue, I think, this month or next month. So that's another thing I found. Xi Jinping has put together so many different conferences. The first periphery level relations conference, that was 3 years ago. The Central Foreign Affairs Conference. These kind of conferences make big policy shift, major policy shift on those conferences, which did not happen. Normally a conference like that with 10 years, 20 years to have one. Now Xi Jinping has almost every this field have a conference. On the Xinjiang affairs, on Tibetan affairs, almost every issue, he personally get involved. So that's why I don't understand. He has only 24 hours like we have, but he got into so many issues. Strong personality.
Okay.
So can I?
Let's connect in a few more questions.
Can I just respond? So
Okay.
when I was doing my research in China this last round, I spoke with some of the people that were involved in the Taiwan, like quarterly now conferences, and I asked them about the difference between these kind of all hands meetings for the Taiwan group versus previously, and they said that the difference is that Xi Jinping's talking about it. Yeah. That the media is publishing that we are meeting once a quarter to talk about Taiwan or Tibet or Xinjiang or whatever it is. Whereas previously under Hu Jintao, they met with the same regularity, they just didn't publish it.
Look, when you talk about those regular lower level meetings, nowadays they even don't call the state council meeting, they call central.
Yeah, I'm talking about the central meetings.
The party is in charge.
Yeah.
So they changed all those lectures. And if you study those conferences, it should be very, very strong indicator of the power dynamics. They change the names, totally change the names nowadays.
All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Lauren, thank you. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I have just a few thoughts, and a lot of them I think echo questions other people or comments other people have made. I guess first is she implementer or leader? And so that, I'm giving you a binary choice and it may be some kind of spectrum, but I think kind of saying something more definitive on that. Situating it in Xi's broader issues with the party. Several people have talked about the corruption and purge, but kind of situating it in terms of other issues he may be facing. And then how a leader would guide or lead the party, maybe drawing on some past historical successes in terms of leaders moving the party in a certain way. And then given your argument then, which kind of seems to be the party as preeminent, maybe a comment on what this then means for other actors like the United States and Taiwan, and then if you do want to move policy, how do you then try to get the party to move and change direction on this?
Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about other actors and, on the Taiwan issue in particular, there are other actors involved, the PLA in particular. There's the anti-secession law, there's tradition and all these policy statements made by the government over decades. There's the fact that legitimacy depends on such a great degree to at least keeping this issue in check. So, if you're looking at the Taiwan issue, this is sort of the best choice, and to what extent does the leader have, I mean, there's certain decisions obviously that would have to be made by the General Secretary, but how much leeway is there short of that, and how different would policy be with, Tsai taking power in Taiwan if someone else were in charge? It seems pretty constrained as to the range of responses the government can take.
So on that, let me add one point. On Taiwan issue, there are three sets of big variables to determine China policy. One, China domestic dynamics, power transition, power politics, policy structure change. Second is the Taiwan domestics, as you mentioned, taking this time. Third is international factors. The most important is the U.S. factor. So the three factors add into the policy making process. So comparing the other two variables, international variable, Taiwan variable, then how China domestic variable has been shifted, changed in your study.
I mean, put in political science terms, what you're saying is that there's a lack of variability on the DV, right? That the DV can't move that much, that they're kind of locked into a specific policy, and whether Brantley won't matter. Eric Higginbotham or Xi Jinping is in charge. At the end of the day, there's the band is a small band, right?
Unless it's Trump.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the political risks to a leader are so high, and the record is so well established on that point that yes, I think that the leeway may be much more constrained on that particular issue.
Yeah, and this is really something that's very hard for you to address. You can't open up options for the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, it is what it is, and you've kind of got to deal with it. And this is kind of a question we're dealing with the Taiwan issue, is these constraints that folks have mentioned.
Right.
Well, Xi Jinping met with Biden. That was different.
That's a very good example of the personal role. I talked to people. The Taiwan Affairs Office was not involved.
And that was a surprise to Taiwan.
Not involved. Entirely between his office and the Ma Ying-jeou's office. Not a bureaucratic level. That's very surprising.
So I mean that's an interesting case. But on the other hand, roll back a little ways. I mean, you have the election of Ma Ying-jeou, and then what happens? Did they move any missiles? Did they, were there any confidence building measures? No. I mean, and so, I don't know what whose inclination would have been, but clearly didn't happen.
Yeah.
But only something you can do it. However, at the time, this is December before the elections, everybody in China knew that Ma Ying-jeou was that the Kuomintang was going to lose. So it wasn't done. It was done as a sort of situation center with the Kuomintang rather than as the beginning of something that could continue.
And also,
that was impressive.
Hu Jintao was still in office. That would not happen. Hu Jintao would not have this kind of gut.
The guts. The policy. Hu Jintao's last statement on Taiwan policy was very, very soft and cuddly.
The response?
I don't really want to wade into this last bit about whether it was who or not, because Andrew Shaw, I hope one day will write a memoir about how he started to pitch to China in 2009 and 2010, before Xi Jinping took office, that there should be some sort of a summit before Hu Jintao stepped down. So I don't really want to wade into that debate. But how much leeway is there for a PRC leader towards Taiwan? That's something that, Yeah, Josh, you're right. Like I'm kind of, my hands are tied on that. I can't really ever give a good answer to that just because of the nature of the system. I think there is, I would hope that there's a little bit more leeway in terms of how, at least ideologically, from leader to leader, Taiwan is shaped within the political framework. I don't think in terms of actual tactics, you know, it's really just political, military, economic, and the occasional kind of legal pressure in terms of international space for Taiwan. But I really, yeah, and from my research more broadly, there's slight tweaks, slight revisions, but not much leeway. There's just really, especially after the Shima summit, been painted into a wall, and there's not much wiggle room from that, I don't think. The first question and feedback about the implementer versus leader, I don't remember who that came from. But I really appreciate those points about kind of situating this within the broader context of what other decisions Xi Jinping has made or what other issues can be comparative. The one that comes to mind actually would be Hong Kong, which was addressed kind of at the outset of the discussion and I never touched upon. But how has Xi Jinping and the party really cracked down and ratcheted up the pressure on Hong Kong, and whether that's much more implementing, if I was to choose a label for Hong Kong, as implementing, but then is Taiwan as a kind of separate case, is it also an implementer kind of moment for Xi Jinping, or is it a leader? I don't know. So that's a very good question and something I'll think about more.
So it's almost like stewardship rather than...
Yeah.
Hong Kong is
shepherding almost, yeah.
Xi Jinping changed the Hong Kong policy entirely, ruled the Hong Kong policy entirely.
So I would push back gently and say that Xi Jinping has implemented a policy that already existed. He just chose to crack down on the pressure.
When the chief executive went to Beijing to meet with Hu Jintao, they sit as equals. Now Xi Jinping wants to sit under him. So I'm the king. You are vassal to me. So we changed the whole dynamics there because of Xi Jinping.
Okay, well, so maybe coming back to the first comment, I will have to rethink if I choose to use Hong Kong as a comparative example, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
But you don't need to really decide whether it's separate the two. Why can't we just accept that Xi Jinping was a more effective leader than Hu Jintao, and he was able to resolve certain foreign policy challenges when China faces, and accept the continuity of lots of the proposals, the groups, the networks were already there, but who could not do it? And when the Xi administration came with a renewed party leadership and the messaging, the foreign policy actually was more cohesive and in some aspects could be more effective. So it doesn't have, they don't have to be either or, and the party matters, then Xi Jinping doesn't matter, or Xi Jinping matters, then the party doesn't matter. They are supposed to mutually reinforcing, but under Hu, in the last 10 years, they were not mutually reinforcing.
Yeah, to some degree, I guess, what's going on under Xi Jinping's administration is a correction of some of the problems that had been there during Hu Jintao's tenure. Now, the concentration of power could be seen as a reversal of the excessive decentralization of power under Hu Jintao. But to what extent this is the destruction of the pre-existing institutions of the party? It just depends on how we define what an institution is and what institutionalization or deinstitutionalization is. Yes.
I just have a sort of I don't know what to call it, maybe a sort of depart from the context of just Xi Jinping, the person, party, the institution, the organization, and put it in a larger context of the milestones that Professor Lee indicated earlier, these centennial milestones coming up. And Xi Jinping came into power, I think, to respond to what you presented in the paper is, as a product of the party at a point in time when, after 30 years of development, although it looks glorious to the, China is the admiration of many developing countries, the party is facing some crisis of these lack of leadership and corruption issues. So it presented an opportunity for someone like Xi Jinping to come to power and say, here I have the grand vision. In the past, there are strategies in China's development. Now I have a grand strategy. This is much longer term. And so I don't know whether anyone in the room has captured this little clip that I happened to pick up. A Chinese reporter asked a question to Xi Jinping's translator, who was the appointed translator, Xu Fang, I think it's her name. So you can see her, following Xi Jinping around, coming to the U.S., went to China. So the question is, what is he like as a statesman? How is he different from past leaders? What is he doing now? So she's extremely articulate. So she said that Xi Jinping listens very well before he speaks. And he promises a few things, 3 to 4 things, I think 4 things. I only remember 3 now. He says, he promises that under his watch, there is no territorial sacrifice. There won't be. Under his watch, there won't be a diminishing public welfare, social well-being, in other words. So people's lives are not going to be compromised. He's going to address poverty and inequality issues. And most of all, this is tied to China's identity in the next probably half century, which is I'm not going to compromise 5,000 years of civilization, Chinese civilization. And that ties to the notion of civilization state rather than nation state. So why is Xi Jinping a product of the party or party product of Xi Jinping? I think it's really the two works hand in glove together. And because Xi Jinping can articulate, as many people already commented so far, is he can really articulate a vision for China in the next century, in the next half century. This, again, grand vision, grand strategy. And that's something perhaps you could address a little more. And I don't know, that probably requires a book rather than
Xi Jinping talk too much.
Well,
talking all the time.
Oh, yeah. I understand.
Yeah, it's
Party Congress, the video came out in WeChat at one provincial group meeting. One young woman entrepreneur was talking. He just interrupted. Said, "Oh, what's the product?" She said, "Oh, we produce liquor." "What's the liquor name?" She told her him. She said, "Oh, it should be changed name." Then how much you sell? She said $100, 100 yuan.
I'm sure he talks a lot.
Yeah, he said, "Oh, too expensive. Why you sell so much? 30." So that's not the leader, and that's what we talk about.
So
yeah.
The general emperor named below 20.
That's Xi Jinping. I'm so amused by him.
I thought it's a great example of Xi Jinping's ability to articulate for China or for the party is the Davos last year, not this year. After the election of Donald Trump, is anti-trade and whatever, he sees that prime time opportunity and go there and made a huge bang. I thought that was his moment.
All right, the time is up for our panel. Let's thank our three presenters.